It's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming, and it's lovely to see your swanky new building. So I'm going to be talking to you about work that we've been doing in my group over the last few years. And as is typical when PIs give talks, I didn't really do any of this work. It was all done by people far more talented and clever than me. In particular, these three PhD students here that I put up on the slide, Becky Hooper, Luca Hahn, and Josh Arbon. So let's dive in. So the broad question I'm interested in tackling here is this long-standing idea that there's a link between sociality and cognition. So if you think of the animals that we tend to anthropocentrically perhaps think of as clever, we tend to think of things like, the primates, cetaceans, elephants, corvids, and so on. And all of these things, aside from apparently being pretty cognitively sophisticated and having big brains, they are all social. And so over the years, many people have argued that this isn't a coincidence, that there must be a causal link between sociality and cognition. And this basically boils down to the premise that social life is hard. So the argument is that whereas things in the physical world are unlikely to react and respond dynamically to what you do to them, social agents, other individuals, will do. And so if you're dealing with social problems, you've got a far more dynamic problem. There's more potential information that you need to keep track of. So this is quite a compelling argument, and I think if you reflect on your own life, certainly true if I reflect on mine, you think, well, what are the hardest things that I need to do in my day-to-day life? Usually dealing with relationships is one of the hardest things that you need to do. So this idea has become very popular. It's widely known as social intelligence or social brain hypothesis. And it's fairly widely accepted as well in lay circles. But there are some interesting challenges and quibbles with it. So first of all, I think there are some interesting conceptual problems around this idea that social life is intrinsically cognitively demanding. And we and other people have written a few papers where we think about some of these issues. So for instance, if you think about groups in which individuals are comprised primarily of family or kin, in many ways, conflicts of interests might be reduced in those groups. And so you tend to see that actually the need to track information about who's doing what to whom may be reduced. And in fact, you tend to see that cooperative breeders, for example, tend to have particularly small brains for their body size. And there's also been some interesting theoretical analysis of this sort of question. So Mauricio González Forero and Andy Gardner had an interesting model a few years ago where they suggested that actually in cooperative groups where individuals can share information and where you can benefit from the skills of other individuals, again, this might reduce the cognitive challenges associated with life and lead to the evolution of smaller brain sizes. So I think it's not necessarily clear that living in social groups is going to create cognitive demands. In some cases, it might actually reduce them. There are also, if you look at the literature, quite a lot of variation in the results that people are finding. Some of these results seem to be quite contradictory. So one of the classic ways that people look at this issue is by trying to correlate aspects of social life, some measure of social complexity with measures of brain size. And I'm sure most of you know kind of classic results from Robin Dunbar's work, for example, where there seems to be a relationship between the neocortex ratio and group size in primates. But again, people have recently started to question some of these ideas. So phylogenetic analyses suggest that actually in primates, it may not be sociality after all, but it might be diet that's more important. So if you're a frugivorous primate, you may have greater need to keep track of the availability of ephemeral fruits that might ripen at unpredictable times in your forest habitat. So perhaps that might be associated with brain size. And we see similar sorts of disagreements in birds. So again, there's been this idea shown on this graph that birds that live in these societies with bonded relationships tend to have brains that are larger than one might expect. But we've done some analyses looking at this, and really you get hugely variable results depending on how exactly you parameterize your models, which variables you put in, how you define your models, and so on. So I think there isn't a particularly consistent association here between your brain size measures and your measures of sociality. But this idea is quite common in the literature, nevertheless, that people have argued, well, in primates, it's the size of your groups that matters. It's having lots and lots of different relationships. People have suggested that in birds, it might be more linked to the need to maintain long-term pair bonds and to be able to anticipate and predict what your partner is doing. So I think another challenge with this area of research is that in comparative cognition, people are often interested in testing or trying to discern whether there's evidence for human-like cognitive traits in other animals. And so this means that a lot of the work on social cognition is focused on tasks where the ecological relevance to animals living in their natural environments may not be entirely clear. So, for example, there are some neat experiments looking at theory of mind in primates using eye tracking technology to try and discern whether individuals respond to false beliefs. There are also some very famous experiments testing things like fairness or inequity aversion, so this idea that individuals might be sensitive to receiving different pay for the same work. But I think in a lot of these cases, it's not obvious what the adaptive benefit might be of these sorts of traits to individuals living in their natural environments. And a final issue, I think, with these arguments is one of causation. So the classic line of argument goes like this. It suggests that societies shape minds. In other words, if you live in complex, dynamic social groups, this is going to create selection pressures for cognitive abilities to allow you to track and respond to information about other individuals. But the reverse might also be true, because if individuals are making decisions about who to associate with and how to behave, then those decisions themselves will give rise to social structure. So you might have this dynamic feedback between minds and societies. So these are some of the ideas that we're interested in trying to address in the Cornish Jackdaw Project, which is my long-term field site of jackdaws. So jackdaws are birds of the crow family. It's a group of animals that's received a lot of attention from people who are interested in cognition. But the vast majority of the work has been in captivity for obvious reasons, that you're able to design really neat, carefully controlled experiments in captivity in a way that's difficult to do in the wild. But that does mean that we often then don't have this clear link with what the animals actually need to do to get by in their daily lives. So we study these birds down in Cornwall. We've got a bunch of different nest box colonies shown here in red. We're actually setting up a couple of new ones. And we also monitor the birds in winter roosts that are shown here in blue. And I set up this study with Gil McIver, who's here in the middle. So Gil was my postdoc since I started at the University of Exeter back in 2012. That's when we started the jackdaw colonies, and sadly moved on now. He's now doing a postdoc in Vienna. But with Gil and this lovely collection of great people, we've been able to do all sorts of interesting things over the years. We've ringed over 4,000 individuals now. We're able to monitor breeding success in much the same way that, those of you who are familiar with the White and Woods system, that's something that we try in our own little way to emulate. So, as I mentioned to you, people have argued that in birds, one of the key drivers of cognitive evolution might be pair bonding, in particular, maintenance of long-term pair bonds. So we were interested in addressing this idea. So jackdaws form typically lifelong pair bonds. You can see a pair at their nest box. So they tend to pair up when they're very young. They tend to stay together. Divorce rates are very low. They happen, but they're very rare. And they are almost entirely genetically monogamous. So unlike most birds that sneak off and have extra pair matings here and there, these guys tend to be pretty faithful to their partners. So we thought, okay, well, let's try and get at some of the fundamental assumptions, if you like, of this idea that there's a link between pair bonding and the selection on cognition. So first of all, we need to think about whether there's variation. So might the strength of pair bonds vary between different pairs? And is this consistent over time? If it is, then we might start to think that there's potential for selection to act on whatever traits it is that enables individuals to form and maintain strong pair bonds. Are there any links between pair bond strength and some kind of cognitive ability? And finally, are there any consequences? So do we have evidence that strong pair bonds provide fitness benefits? So this is work that Becky Hooper and Luca Hahn did on the jackdaws. And the answer to the first two questions is quite clearly yes. So this is just a little graph of variation in pair bond strength. And we measure pair bond strength by quantifying rates of affiliative interactions within the pair, the amount of time that individuals spend together. We stick it all into a big PCA, and we get this robust and very repeatable measure of pair bond strength, where quite consistently, and we find this over the course of a season, but also over the course of multiple years, you have some pairs that, to put it anthropomorphically, are very lovey-dovey and spend all their time together, preening each other, and so on, and other pairs that are more like ships in the night and, just see each other occasionally. So there does seem to be a lot of variation, and this variation does seem to be consistent over time. Now, might this be in some way linked to cognition? Now, this is a very difficult thing to test, and we have tried to get at it in kind of a roundabout way. So if you adhere to the classic kind of behavioral ecology definition of cognition, which is that cognition is the processes that allow individuals to gather information, remember it, use it to make decisions, and so on, then we might think that one way to think about whether individuals are keeping track of information about their partners is to think about responsiveness to your partner's state. So we started doing this through an experiment that Becky ran, and this was actually testing something else. So she was interested in testing whether jackdaws showed consolation. So the idea here, and this is something that primatologists get very excited about, is that if individuals in strong relationships, if one of those individuals has had a very stressful event, then the partner might then console, might provide affiliation afterwards. But one of the issues with these experiments is that they're typically confounded because the individual who's meant to be providing the consolation also experienced the stressful event. So it may be that they're actually just trying to reduce their own stress rather than trying to reduce the stress of the partner. So we tested this by looking at female jackdaws in their nest boxes. And what we did was when the male partner was away, we used playback to simulate the presence of an intruder. Now in jackdaws, although they are genetically monogamous, you do also get occasionally males who will come in, not the pair-bonded partner, and try to force copulation with the female. And this is a very kind of violent and seemingly unpleasant affair that she responds to with a great deal of aggression. So the idea was, well, what happens if the female has experienced this stressor and then the male comes back? Now, spoiler alert is we don't really see any evidence of consolation. So we don't see a big increase in rates of affiliation. In fact, what we do tend to see is kind of the opposite. So by and large, so this shows the behavior of the male before and after the stressor, and here I've plotted on the y-axis the rates of affiliation. So overall, rates of affiliation actually tend to go down rather than up. And in the majority of cases, males actually respond by leaving and seeking information, which I think in a way makes sense, right? If you've got evidence that something stressful has happened, perhaps rather than sticking around and giving your partner a hug, it might make sense to go out and see what's going on. But there's also a lot of variation in the responses of different males. And I think regardless of their response, these changes in behavior suggest that they are somehow able to detect and respond to the state of their partner. So we then thought, well, I wonder if that might be related to this measure of the strength of the pair bond. And it seems we've got some evidence that it is. So in pairs that seem to have stronger pair bonds, we get a bigger magnitude of change in the male's behavior. So the male seems to be more responsive. So this is, I think, tentative evidence that there may be some link between this responsiveness to your partner's state. And an interesting thing here is that there's nothing observable about the partner's state. So we've analyzed these videos until the cows come home. We cannot see any detectable change in what the female is doing. But nevertheless, the male, when he comes back, seems to be able to know that something is up and modify his behavior. So we've got perhaps a little bit of tentative information or tentative evidence here that there may be a link between pair bond strength and some aspect of cognition of partner responsiveness. So what about the final question? Is there a benefit to having strong pair bonds? Now here the relationship, the evidence is actually fairly mixed. So one thing we looked at was whether there may be a link to the regulation of hatching asynchrony. So jackdaws typically, like quite a lot of birds, will lay an egg a day, and so the latest eggs are less likely to survive. And the regulation of the period over which this happens, or the degree of hatching asynchrony, is the result of the interplay between male and female behavior, because the female incubates, and then it's the male's responsibility to go out and find food, and he feeds the female. So if he's not feeding the female enough, then she's going to have to go off and seek food on her own, which is going to influence the amount of time that she can spend incubating, and is likely to affect the hatching asynchrony that arises. And so what we found, we collected data here across 4 years, and it just so happened that 2 of these years were really good years. So they were kind of resource-rich years in which the productivity of the population as a whole was very high. They produced lots of chicks and lots of big fat chicks. And there were 2 years where these were resource-poor years, where the population tended to do quite poorly. And what we see is that there seems to be a relationship or an interaction between pair bond strength and the year. So there are arguments out there in the literature that I always forget which way around this is, I've got to remind myself. In resource-poor years, the prediction is that it actually should pay to spread your eggs out, right? Because spreading your eggs out means that you can have brood reduction, and so there's less risk that you're going to lose the entire brood. Whereas in resource-rich years, the prediction is that there should be lower hatching asynchrony, so the eggs should be closer in time. And we do tend to see that in birds that have stronger pair bonds in these resource-rich years, shown here in black and yellow, then when you've got stronger pairs, you have lower hatching asynchrony, whereas the reverse is true in resource-poor years. So it suggests that there may be some link between having strong pair bonds, being able to maintain these strong bonds, and the regulation of this behavior. But then, does this actually translate into any detectable impacts on reproductive fitness? The answer is no. We looked across lots of different measures, and we cannot see any relationship between the strength of pair bonds and the proportion of hatchlings fledged, the total number of fledglings produced, the total mass of the fledglings. So there doesn't seem to be a clear and straightforward association here, which suggests that maybe we need to be thinking about other important factors. So clearly, the strength of the pair bond isn't sufficient to explain variation in reproductive success. So this gets us thinking about the wider social context, and in particular about the need to make strategic social decisions around who to interact with. So jackdaws live in these interesting societies, where, as I mentioned, the core of jackdaw societies are these long-term pair bonds. But then they're colonial breeders, and so you typically see that within a breeding colony, individuals know each other, they forage together. But then you also get, it's a very fission fusion sort of dynamic, where individuals from different breeding colonies will sometimes meet each other on feeding grounds and interact. And then during the winter months, you also get these vast flocks of hundreds or even thousands of individuals who gather together in winter roosts. So there may be, in some situations, potential benefits to being able to know who you're associating with and respond to individuals based on your past interactions. So we were interested in trying to understand, first of all, whether jackdaws benefit from partner choice decisions, if they benefit from choosing who they're going to associate with, and then whether they might actually learn to adjust their social associations to maximize rewards. And if that is the case, then might it also be the case that the decisions that individuals are making around who to interact with might affect the structure of groups as a whole? So, to get at this first question, the potential benefits of partner choice decisions, Luca ran a study where we used these automated feeders, similar to the ones that those of you who work at White and Woods will be familiar with. So these feeders detect pit tags embedded in a color ring on every jackdaw's leg, and so that provides us with really rich data. Every time a bird visits, the feeder will record the time of that visit and who that individual is. So we set up a situation where the birds had to queue. So here you can see that there's one bird here on the front perch who can feed, and then there's another perch behind, and the bird that occupies the perch behind is not able to feed. They just have to stand there. So in a sense, this bird at the back is incurring sort of an opportunity cost, because this is time that they could be off feeding somewhere else, but instead they will sit with a partner. So when we analyzed all the data that emerged from these, we call them dyadic feeders, we found very clear evidence that mated pairs and kin preferentially forage together. So you see these dyadic feeding queuing associations. So this just shows here, these are the proportions of kin, pair bonds, or just other random dyadic associations that are possible within the population. And if you look at the number of events that we actually observed, the visits, there's a very clear difference here. So kin and pairs are overrepresented. So these individuals seem to be associating with each other more often than you would expect if individuals are just associating by chance. So it seems that the birds are making choices about who they're going to associate with in these situations. We also find that if we look at the latencies to arrive, so the latency for one perch and then the second perch to be occupied, the pairs and the kin tend to arrive more synchronously, so that latency is larger if we're looking at these other dyads compared to dyads composed of pairs or kin. And I should say that when I say kin, I mean direct kin, so these are parents and offspring or siblings, right? So we're not looking at, we don't have kind of quantitative measures of relatedness. So it seems that these birds they must be coordinating their actions in some sense to arrive more synchronously. And there seem to be some interesting benefits. So if you're feeding in the presence of a partner who's queuing behind you, if that individual is kin or your pair bonded mate, you're able to feed for much longer than if it's somebody else. So there seems to be a very clear benefit of, we might call it social support, of having one of these closely associated partners with you. Interestingly, even having one of these other individuals, so we might call them acquaintances, queuing behind you, that still allows you to feed for longer than if you were feeding alone. So I think this provides some nice evidence that these birds are making decisions about who to associate with. They might be willing to incur short-term opportunity costs to remain with a social partner who's feeding, and by doing so, they allow that social partner to feed for longer, so to get potential benefits. But we've seen here that in the data I've shown you, the relationships that really seem to matter are these relationships within pair-bonded partners and between kin. But might these animals also be able to learn to adjust their associations based on past outcomes? So one way we've looked at this is in the context of social information use. So typically in many animals, there are biases towards learning from older and more experienced individuals. So learning from your elders is typically useful. There's a knowledge asymmetry between young, naive individuals and older, more experienced individuals. So you tend to see that social learning is biased towards learning from older individuals. And we've found that this is, in fact, the case in the jackdaws. So we've run some experiments, for example, where we present the birds with novel foods, and we see that some individuals will take the risk and sample these new foods and learn that they are palatable, and other individuals learn by observing those first innovators, and you do see this pattern where the young tend to learn from the old. But there may be situations in which the opposite is true, right? And so this is something that we see very clearly in the digital revolution in human societies, where I'm sure the younger people in the room have probably many a time had to show your parents or older relatives how to use their phones and so on. So, there may be situations in which it pays for older individuals to learn from the young. And it's also the case that in many animals, young individuals tend to be particularly innovative. They tend to often have lower neophobia, so they may be less scared to try new things. So if these young individuals are coming up with new ideas or new information, and older individuals won't learn from them, then obviously that information is lost. You're going to have a cultural dead end. So in jackdaws, analyses of the social network show that adults prefer the company of other adults. So you have these age-structured societies where similar-aged individuals tend to hang out together. So here we've got adults in orange and juveniles in kind of green. So that's the kind of standard state of affairs. We were interested to see whether individuals might learn to adjust their social associations. So to test this, Josh Arben ran a fun experiment in which we had pairs of interconnected feeders. And so these feeders were wired together, and the idea was that if a juvenile turned up at one of these feeders on its own, or in any situation, juveniles always get access to high-quality foods. There's lots of delicious mealworms in here. If an adult is feeding while there's a juvenile present, so as we show in this picture here, so juvenile, oops, my cursor working? I've been under the misapprehension that you can see this cursor and you can't, never mind. Anyway, so if there's an adult that's feeding, co-occupying a feeder when a juvenile is there, then the adult also gets access to the food. But if an adult joins another adult, then the feeders lock. Or if an adult comes alone, the adult also gets nothing. So the question is, can the adults learn that in order to get these high-quality rewards, they've got to pay attention to juveniles and join the juveniles at the feeders? So we analyze these data using a technique called relational event models. This is a kind of time-to-event modeling that allows you to account for dynamic changes within social networks. So we were analyzing over 2,000 associations involving 164 individuals. And so what we see is that this is as a function of previous successes. So if you had experience of associating with a juvenile and gaining rewards, as you gain that experience, you start to slightly increase your rates of co-occupation with other juveniles and reduce rates of co-occupation with other adults. In other words, you learn to stop associating with adults and start hanging out with juveniles instead. And typically the adult jackdaws also tend to bully juveniles, so they'll often boot them out of the way in order to get access to food resources. But obviously in this situation, if you do that, then you are limiting the amount of food that you might be able to get. So if you boot a juvenile out of the way, you might be able to scrounge a little bit of food because the feeders take a second to close. But if you refrain from booting them out of the way, then you're going to have access to the food for as long as the juvenile stays there. And so if we look at displacements, then we see that, again, the birds seem to be able to learn to refrain from displacing. So they're much less likely, as they acquire experience of previous success with juveniles, they are less likely to displace juveniles compared to other adults. So I think this provides some nice evidence that the jackdaws are able to gain information about their interactions, their previous interactions, and use that information to adjust the interactions that they have in future. One interesting result in this analysis was that this effect also seemed to generalize across juveniles as a cohort. So it isn't just that, if I've had experience associating with Billy the juvenile, I'm going to carry on associating with him. It's that having had that experience, I then generalize across juveniles as a cohort. So, to go back to this question of strategic social decisions. So we've seen that jackdaws seem to benefit from making partner choice decisions. They also seem to be able to learn to adjust their associations to maximize rewards. And as a consequence, we also see that individual decisions can affect group structures. In the experiment I've just talked about, we see this change where individuals used to preferentially associate in the network with same-aged individuals, and that flips. And there's also some evidence in that experiment that this effect extends beyond the experimental feeders. So when we look at foraging interactions in non-experimental feeders where we're not manipulating the rewards, we also see some carryover where the birds that have learned to associate with juveniles and to be more tolerant towards juveniles are also sort of showing similar patterns at non-experimental feeders. So I think this is interesting for a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons I thought was quite interesting is that there are some theoretical ideas around the evolution of cooperation suggesting that if individuals can learn to associate with compatible partners, then you might start to get the emergence of clusters of compatible partners, creating favorable conditions for cooperation to emerge and be maintained. But something that these models don't account for is that individuals might have different sorts of relationships and that there may be benefits to maintaining certain long-term relationships that mean that actually that might reduce your plasticity in being able to just ditch old friends and associate with new ones in order to maximize rewards. So we tested this idea using another automated experiment. And the idea behind this experiment, I'll try and illustrate it using these graphics. So again, at the core of jackdaw societies, we have these long-term pair bonds. And this pair might have some offspring. So I'm showing these connections in red, and we're going to call them affiliates. Now, each of these individuals might also associate with some other individuals. We'll just call them non-affiliates for ease. And of course, each of these non-affiliates will have connections of their own, and so you quickly build up into this complicated social network. Now, what we did in this experiment was we randomly divided the individuals, we randomly assigned them to one of two experimental groups. Now, the birds don't know which experimental group they're in. This is just something that we came up with. So each individual in the population would be in either group A or group B, unbeknownst to them. And in some situations, like you see in the middle there, individuals within a pair bond, or these affiliates, might be in different groups. In other situations, they might be in the same group as each other. So this experiment was run by, again, two PhD students, Mike Kings and Josh Arbon. And the way this one worked is that we had these feeders, and within each feeder, there was high quality food and low quality food. So the high quality food is for the jackdaws mealworms, and the low quality food is grain, and we know that they've got a very strong preference for the mealworms. That's very consistent across all of the birds. So in this experiment, we set up a situation where if a bird came alone, so either a group A individual or a group B individual comes to a feeder alone, the door will open and allow them access to grain, to the low quality food. If an individual comes with a same group individual, so A with A or B with B, then they get access to the really good stuff, to the high quality food. But if they come with an individual from a different group, so A with B, then that triggers a lockout, so the feeders will lock, nobody can get any food for 2 minutes. So the question is basically, can the jackdaws learn who is worth associating with and who is not worth associating with? And hopefully this video will work. Let's see. There we go. So there we've got an individual feeding alone, so it gets grain. It's been displaced by somebody else. Now, this second guy who's arrived is from the same treatment group, so now they can both access the high-quality mealworms. So this is an example of a success in our experiment. So these two individuals are compatible within the experimental design, and so they are able to get the high-quality food. So again, we analyzed these data using these relational event models, and we see very clear evidence that individuals do learn to associate with compatible partners. So as the experiment progresses, the number of observed successes increases pretty dramatically. But then if you start to dig into the data, you see there's some interesting patterns. So interestingly, we find that individuals do learn who to associate with, so they learn to associate with same group individuals, but this is only true when we look at these non-affiliates. So these are basically individuals outside of pair-bonded or kin relationships. So here you see on the x-axis the number of previous associations between members of a dyad, and on the y-axis we've got the association rate. And so you can see that as they are acquiring information, these same class individuals start to preferentially associate with each other. But if we look at affiliates, so these are pair-bonded individuals, parents and offspring and siblings, we actually don't see this effect. If anything, we see a bit of evidence for the opposite happening. We can talk about why that might be. But there's no evidence here that these individuals are learning to stop associating with their affiliate partners if those partners are in a different treatment group, or to start associating with others. So there seems to be this interesting constraint here where individuals are able to adjust their social associations with their weaker social ties, if you like, but when it comes to their stronger social ties, they will carry on coming to feeders together, even if that means that they gain no rewards at all. So what might the group level consequences of these decisions be? Well, to illustrate that, we can think about clustering. So in the network world, people generally define a cluster when two individuals share a common associate. So if we look at two individuals, so let's say that these are pair-bonded partners, if they happen to be in different treatment groups, then if we look at the individuals that they could potentially associate with, and we look at the triads, so shown here in green, so we can see that in each of these cases, any given triad would have two individuals from one group and one individual from another. However, if these two individuals are from the same treatment group, then we can produce a subset of triads, shown there in purple, where all three members of the triad are from the same treatment group. So we might call them a cluster of compatible individuals. And so if we look at the proportion of those compatible clusters in comparison to what you would expect through random association, you can see that over time you have this very clear increase in the number of same class triads. So the effect is there, but it's also very weak. So we can detect it, but it's not a strong effect. So we estimate it as something like 1.5% per 1,000 association events observed. So we think that this is probably happening because these long-term relationships are constraining the plasticity of the network. So actually individuals aren't entirely free to just learn who to associate with and adjust their relationships accordingly. There are certain relationships that they will maintain despite the short-term benefits that might be gained from associating with somebody else. And if that's the case, then actually the overall network plasticity is likely to be constrained. And so I think that might have some interesting implications for these sorts of models of the evolution of cooperation, which typically don't tend to consider the fact that individuals might need to maintain certain long-term relationships. So to go back to our questions, yes, we've seen that jackdaws benefit from strategic partner choice decisions. They can learn who to associate with. These decisions do seem to affect group structure, but maintaining long-term relationships might also constrain the plasticity of the network. So what does this tell us overall? This is my little sketch of what I think we may learn maybe from these sorts of experiments. So if individual cognition enables decisions, so processes like recognizing different individuals, learning from past experience, remembering the outcomes of past interactions, influences the decisions that individuals are making as to who to interact with. Individuals might then also face trade-offs between investing in associating with long-term partners versus adjusting their relationships for short-term benefits. And the outcomes of these trade-offs will determine the structure of the society that emerges. Now, the structure of this society, in turn, is going to determine the potential for information to spread through networks, for individuals to cooperate with each other, and so on, which will affect fitness outcomes and ultimately lead back to selection on individual cognitive processes. So if we go back to this question that I started with, does social life drive cognitive evolution? We might think about it from the perspective that societies might shape minds. So if we think about it from an uncertainty perspective, is there value in tracking information about social partners? But there's also the perspective of social construction. So we might ask, well, how does social structure emerge from the decisions that individuals are making? So maybe this is the wrong question. Rather than asking whether social life drives cognitive evolution, we ought to ask how decision-making and social structure co-evolve. So I shall leave you with that and just say a very special thank you to Gil McIver, who, as I mentioned, was a glorious postdoc on the project for many, many years, and without whom none of this work would have happened, to the lovely people who gave us money, and most of all to you for coming.